Hi guys, welcome back to another review. Today we're going to be discussing Gogol's classic work, Dead Souls. I'm Colin, and this is Colin for Books. Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls had an importance to the evolution of the Russian novel that far outstripped that of any single novel in the English tradition. Indeed, the importance of Dead Souls to authors like Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky far outstrips in significance any single one work of a Dickens or of an Austen or a Bronte. And indeed, contrary to the usually very serious nature of the novel, Dead Souls is, rather, a comedy, but the comedic nature of the story isn't immediately apparent to a modern English reader. Indeed, it took me 2 reads to figure out that what I was reading here was a comedy. Indeed, a great amount of it is comparable to the type of comedy that one might find, for instance, in a more overt form in Cervantes' Don Quixote. Indeed, there's a number of parallels that one can find between these 2 great comedies, the seminal Spanish work Don Quixote and Gogol's Dead Souls. Both seem in many ways to be odysseys, comedic odysseys. There's journeys in both books. In fact, they're structured around a journey structure, and both works end up with the hero coming to ruin. Even though Gogol's method was humorous, the point of his story was a very serious one. It was a critique, an analysis of the very inhumane system of serfdom in the late Russian Empire. Now, serfdom was a structure which was very similar to slavery in United States before the Civil War. Students of the Western Middle Ages, of course, would be familiar with the serfdom system that is at the root of feudalism. Now, feudalism evolved in the Middle Ages in different forms over the many centuries in which it was practiced. But in the end, serfs were tied to the land, to the people who owned the land. Up until serfdom was abolished in the Russian Empire in 1861. Now, Dead Souls was written in 1842, 19 years before Tsar Alexander II abolished the serfdom system. A serf could be bought and sold, traded, used and abused, almost without respect to their inherent rights. In this sense, Russia was a very backward economy. The economies of Western Europe had long evolved away from the system of serfdom, but Russia was very much behind in terms of industrialization, and in fact, in important movements as exemplified by, for instance, the French Revolution and the development of the system of common law in England, with its rules about habeas corpus and so on, was very much far behind in Russia. Now, one could compare, for instance, the Russia of the 19th century with the United States up until the Civil War, where it was still possible to think of human beings as belonging to other people, as the possession of other people. With the abolition of serfdom in 1861, or, for instance, the nearly simultaneous abolition of slavery in the United States, we can't think that all of a sudden we're going from cruel treatment of people to some kind of golden age. The fact was, if we compare, for instance, the sufferings discussed in Charles Dickens' works of the time, we know that the life of the poor workers in, for instance, industrial England, industrial London, were not very good. Indentured servitude was known in the United States and in other places all along this period of time. And in fact, after the abolition of serfdom, and we can't any longer call the peasantry serfs, but rather peasants, how improved, in fact, were the lives of the poorest 90% of the Russian people at the time. The lives and sufferings of the poor people in Russia, in fact, continued to feature heavily as a theme and as a background in the works of Russian writers, and indeed the condition of the working class ultimately led to the Russian Revolution in 1917. But of course, these are broad and complicated social economic issues. Now, we're going back a century and a half before that, and we're going to look at this quite early work, what we might call the first great novel of the Russian language. So Dead Souls is about the main character, Chichikov, having figured out a way to play the system, where that he is able to make money off of peasants or serfs who have died, but whose names weren't removed from the census forms. So Chichikov goes from landowner to landowner, and he asks each one, what kind of year he's had, in fact, he's had any peasants die on his property. And invariably, peasants die, and their names aren't removed from the census, because the census is done every 5 or 10 years, and the landowners still have to pay tax on these so-called dead souls. So Chichikov offers to buy them. Now, they can't understand why a person would want to pay for a peasant that he can't get any work out of, but Chichikov's answer to this is basically, let me worry about that side of things. So the landowner can't actually make any money off of these peasants, as far as they can tell, but Chichikov is prepared to pay a price for them. So in the end, what has happened is that he's figured out that sort of government grant to help offset the burden to landowners of peasants having died. Now, Chichikov knows the system much better than anybody else, and so he's able to manipulate the system and indeed make a great deal of money off of this process. So that's the background. That's the whole device. That's the narrative device. But what's important here is the manner in which Gogol is able to present Russian society of the time and to present various different characteristics of landowners. And indeed, ultimately, Dead Souls is about that great mortal sin of greed. The plight of the peasantry, the plight of this poor section of society that in fact dies and that becomes the mechanism by which Chichikov can make money, is only peripherally referred to by the landowners. Time and again, we see the landowners referring to the hardship that the death of peasants has brought to them. There's very little sympathy exhibited for the plight of the peasants themselves. Ultimately, the greatness of the novel consists in the manner in which Gogol can indirectly bring these social issues to the minds and hearts of the reader. He doesn't hammer them with a heavy hammer and throw them bald and bloody in front of the reader. Indeed, there's a very sly and quite exquisite artistic technique here. Artists are always at their best when they can allow something to speak for itself. An artist, whether that be a painter or a writer, simply has to develop an atmosphere and allow the characters and the circumstance to speak for itself. If art is great and a truthful representation of its subject matter, then an artist does not have to spell out the theme they wish to convey. It's very easy to see how an inferior writer would have handled the subject matter, that they would present to the reader, one after another, a series of bad characters that would overtly prove the message that the author is trying to convey. But the fact is, Gogol has the artistic skill, the technique, to present not unidimensional characters, but in fact characters with faults and failings, but also with virtues and other interesting foibles, to present a much more robust or hearty presentation of actual human life. None of his characters, for as outlandish as some of them are caricatures. In fact, each one has their own sense of purpose, their own sense of right and wrong. There are ultimately no people who are just purely evil or just purely good. Indeed, even the main protagonist, who is not a virtuous character, this Chichikov, has some aspects of his character that are admirable, and Gogol does present the childhood and parentage of Chichikov in such a way as to make one sympathetic to him to a certain extent, so that they understand why he would be so avaricious. But regardless of all that, of course, in proper Aristotelian fashion, Chichikov is destroyed by his own vice, by his intrinsic greed. But the life of Chichikov is as much an indictment of his own greediness as it is of the bad conduct of the people with whom he deals. When he's wealthy, when he's successful, the whole world opens up to him, and everyone fawns over him. But the moment he comes upon bad times, or is seen for what he is treated like a pariah. And as I've said, although the subject matter ultimately is a serious one, the manner of Gogol's treatment of it is not serious. In fact, my favorite secondary character in the book is a landowner named Manilov. Now, Manilov, how could one... I think we've all met a Manilov in our life. And let me just read a small passage here for you. "Don't worry about me," Chichikov kept saying. "After you, sir." No, after you, sir," Manilov kept saying, pointing to the door. "You are our guest, sir." "Why, no," Chichikov kept saying. "After you, sir. Please, don't put yourself out on my account." "I'm very sorry, sir, but I cannot possibly permit such a charming and cultured guest to follow me." "Why cultured? Please, sir, after you." "No, after you, sir." "But why, sir?" Just because, sir," Manilov said with an agreeable smile. At last the two friends went through the door sideways, squeezing each other a little. And when Manilov comes to introduce his wife to Chichikov, they strike up a conversation. "And how did you like our little town?" Mrs. Manilov said. "Have you passed your time agreeably there?" "It's a very excellent town, ma'am," Chichikov replied. "A magnificent town, and I've spent a most agreeable time. The society there is most affable." "And how did you find our governor?" said Mrs. Manilov. "Don't you think he is a most estimable and most obliging person?" added Mr. Manilov. "Oh, perfectly true," said Chichikov. "A most estimable person, and how admirably he performs his duties. How well he understands them. I wish we had more people like him. How well he receives people, you know, and how considerate he is in everything he does," Manilov added with a smile, almost closing his eyes with delight, like a tomcat who is being gently stroked behind the ears. "A most courteous and agreeable person," Chichikov went on, "and how clever he is with his hands! I could never have imagined it. How excellently he embroiders all sorts of patterns. He showed me a purse he made. Not every lady could have embroidered it so beautifully." "And the vice-governor?" said Manilov, again screwing up his little eyes. "Don't you think he is a most charming person?" "A most worthy man," replied Chichikov. "And pray, what did you think of our chief of police?" "A very agreeable person, isn't he?" "A most agreeable person, and what an intelligent, well-read man. We played whist at his house with the public prosecutor and the president of the court till small hours. A most worthy man. Well," Mrs. Manilov added, "what's your opinion of the wife of the chief of police? A most charming woman, isn't she?" "Oh, she is one of the worthiest creatures I've ever known," replied Chichikov. After that they did not omit to mention the president of the court and the postmaster, and in this way ran through the names of almost all the civil servants of the town, who all turned out to be most worthy persons. That's just a great example of the type of humor that Gogol employs in his work. Now perhaps I'll just address one final matter. I know that Russian literature isn't perhaps as well known to English readers, of course, as the works of Dickens and so on. But I think that the great works of the 19th century, my favorite ones, there's a little bit of a learning curve to figure out the features of Russian society. You know, what different terms refer to, the significance of different practices and of different terms, the religion of the people and so on. But even if some of the customs and some of the terms are unfamiliar to English readers, this won't inhibit in any way a reader's appreciation of the story itself. The story can stand on its own feet, and the lesson one draws from the story, I say, is a lot less important. Running to the definition, running to the point, is far less important than absorbing the whole literary structure and the whole beauty of the character development and so on. You know, Russian literature has the reputation of being very serious. And I think overall that's true. Russian history has not been an easy thing. The lives of peasantry in the 19th century, leading up to the horrible Russian Revolution, and then the communist regime under Stalin. None of these things seem to lend themselves to unserious works of literature and art, but the fact is, there is something very beautiful in the Russian spirit that's able to examine and, in fact, even make fun of their own traditions and their own custom. Russians are extremely patriotic. There were always limits to ways in which Russian artists would criticize and make fun of their own system. Gogol clearly stays within the bounds of patriotism and the love of his people and his nation. In this way, I think one can compare him to Shakespeare in that sense. Shakespeare, of course, like every artist, is a commentator on culture, on people, on customs, but there's no sense in which Shakespeare steps outside and wants to ultimately reject the world he writes about. And in many ways, this is the same thing with Gogol. It's the same thing with Dostoevsky. Now, the later Tolstoy is another man. He is far more anarchistic, but Gogol, like Dostoevsky, like Turgenev, and Gorky, and Chekhov, are people who write about, who critique, who comment, who explore their own culture because it's a culture they love. Ultimately, Dead Souls is a window into the life of early and middle 19th century Russia. It's humorous enough and yet serious enough to keep our interest. The story is told in a way that never lags, and the timing with which Gogol presents the essential characteristics of his main character Chichikov, and then develops his background, and then develops his prehistory, the thing he's done before we greet him in Dead Souls, his childhood, and ultimately his fate, is a masterful piece of literature. I hope you read Dead Souls. Dead Souls is a book I highly recommend. If you're going to start anywhere in Russian literature, well, you just have to jump in with both feet. You can start with Dead Souls, or you can start with Anna Karenina, or you can start with Brothers Karamazov. They're all wonderful expressions of a wonderful fruition of art, and that is 19th century Russian literature. Thanks very much.